Liking my videos is like giving me a virtual high five. And following my channel is like becoming part of an awesome community. So if you're enjoying what you see, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment to join the conversation. Part 1, Chapter 1. The tone of Revolutionary Road is set in the first chapter as the Laurel players stage their first production before an eager, expectant audience in suburban Connecticut in 1955. Somewhat tenuously, the New York director hired to work with the amateur actors gives them a pep talk the night before the opening, telling them they've got what it takes to put across a stunning performance. But a series of forgotten lines, backstage noises, on-stage bumbling, and just bad acting doom the performance. The play is further handicapped by the fact that the leading man is sick and unable to act, so the director fills in because he knows the lines but does not fit the part physically at all. The opening does serve to introduce April Wheeler as a beautiful, poised young woman, possessed of a lot of stage presence. During intermission, the members of the audience of other middle-class suburbanites wander awkwardly around the high school building, disgruntled but unable to speak about the bad performance. They wander about, wiping perspiration from their hand onto their clothing, while the cast members pace about backstage nervously, wiping perspiration from their brows, wishing only to finish the second act and go home as fast as possible. Although no one wants to go back into the auditorium for the second half of the play, the suburbanites do return and politely sit through the play's conclusion, during which April Wheeler's acting descends to the level of the other cast members, or worse. The final conclusion is experienced as an act of mercy. Part 1, Chapter 2. Frank Wheeler catches a glimpse of the girl he fell in love with as April acts out her part on stage, and his desire is white hot as he makes his way backstage after the curtain comes down. He envisions giving her a great burst of love and approval, laughing off the disastrous production in a round of kisses and compliments. Instead, he finds a disgruntled, quarrelsome April Wheeler in her dressing room, in no mood to be humored. They begin snipping at each other, and their bickering continues outside and into their car as April demands to be taken home without joining friends afterwards for a drink. The war of words escalates in the car until Frank pulls over and slides across the seat to try and take his wife in his arms. April, however, rebuffs him with a sharp, "Leave me alone." Frank retaliates with a tirade about how it's not his fault she never became a real actress and that he's tired of being made a scapegoat. April, in a rage, jumps out of the car and starts walking down the dark highway. Frank follows, imploring her wildly to get back into the car. Finally, she turns back and rests for a moment against the front fender while her husband continues to rage, even threatening to hit her with his closed fist. Defeated, April returns to the car, and they drive in silence back home. Once in bed, Frank tries to apologize to his wife, but realizes the lump in their bed is nothing but piled up bed sheets. Vale has taken a blanket and gone to sleep on the couch downstairs. When Frank approaches and tries to apologize and make up, April gives him only sarcasm and tells him, again, to leave her alone. Part 1, Chapter 3. Frank Wheeler awakens with a debilitating hangover, having stayed up until 4 a.m., drinking alone after the fight with April. He hears a mechanical screeching from the backyard and realizes it's his wife cutting the grass he promised to cut the previous weekend. As he stumbles into his morning, Frank's booze-basted brain goes into flashback mode, and the reader is given a lot of backstory on the current situation. Frank can hardly remember his parents' faces. For example, without the aid of a photograph, he remembers his father's tough, always, incompetent hands that scorned him as a young boy trying to learn how to use woodworking tools. He remembers the pain of loneliness in his childhood. He emphasizes with April's own story of loneliness and lack of affection as a child, and he recalls how their love affair in a seedy shack near Greenwich Village turned serious when she got pregnant, years before they'd planned, which led to a fast marriage, then another child. Frank recalls vividly how April wanted to get an abortion the first time she became pregnant, and was far along in planning it before he knew anything about it. He recalls his anger at not being consulted and her frank admission that she didn't want a child at that time. Frank admits to himself, through the haze of his hangover, that he never really wanted children either. In the midst of this lugubrious bout of self-absorption, Mrs. Givings, the real estate agent who sold them their house, shows up with a large box of sedum, which she describes as excellent grand cover for the yard. Unsure what to say, or even what sedum is exactly, he thanks her as Mrs. Givings tells him she loved the play, which makes him quite uncomfortable. Frank gets to work placing stones in front of the house for a walkway. He uses gigantic stones dug up from behind the house and must dig huge holes into which he rolls the stones, breaking labor as he works, and tries to be pleasant to his children, Jennifer and Michael, as they pepper him with questions. He suddenly realizes that a thrust of his shovel comes close to his son's small, tennis, shoe-clad foot. Frank loses his temper, yells at his kids, and they scatter for the house where Frank sees them taking refuge behind their mother's trousers. Part 1, Chapter 4. On a quiet Sunday morning after their big fight, Frank Wheeler approaches April and tries to apologize once more. April shrugs him off coldly, telling him to take his hands off her and keep his voice down because of the children playing in the next room. Frustrated and hurt, Frank finds temporary solace in reading the Sunday comics to his children, but quickly becomes bored and irritable, wishing he could take a piece of furniture and hurl it through the large plate glass picture window. Morosely, he looks forward to the arrival of the Campbells, Shep and Millie, neighbors who usually make things more cheerful by their presence. However, this Sunday afternoon, the drinks, cigarettes, and conversation failed to ignite the spirit of previous social encounters. There is awkward talk of the failed play, in which Shep also had a role, and some half-hearted discussion of politics that falls flat, as does talk about the mindless neighbors and their barren lawns. The mention of Mrs. Givings brings forth a long, scandalous disclosure by Millie Campbell that the Givings' son, John, had been a brilliant math student at MIT and was an instructor of mathematics at a university before he became insane. Expensive treatments at a private hospital in California were followed by an arrest by the Connecticut State Police for holding his parents hostage at their home, according to Millie Campbell, who adds that John Givings currently is a patient at Green Acres, the state mental hospital. Part 1, Chapter 5. The drab, ugly architecture of the Knox Building in New York City, where Frank Wheeler works in sales promotion, is an emblem of the drab, dull routines that workers inside go through daily. As Frank rides the elevator to the 15th floor, his mind races back to his first trip to this building as a young boy with his father, Earl Wheeler. The two had taken the train to New York from Pennsylvania so that his father could show him the home office and some of the sights of the city. Frank remembers that they have lunch with Earl Wheeler's boss, Oatfields, a large, slovenly man who Frank Wheeler finds disgusting. After a long day in the city, they return home, and Earl is crestfallen. The big promotion that he expected in New York has been shot down by a higher authority, and he will remain on various field assignments until his retirement. Frank now sees that disappointment as the beginning of his father's decline in health, as well as his mother's, and recalls his mixed feeling on taking a job with Knox Business Machines, in part because April was pregnant. On this particular Monday, Frank's erotic obsession with a secretary named Maureen Grube becomes inflamed as they ride the same elevator to work, and he fantasizes about removing her sweater and baring her breasts. He decides to make a pass at her, but determines to be careful and crafty in his approach. Before he can get to Grube, however, he is held prisoner in his own office as a co-worker named Jack Ordway recounts his drunken weekend exploits and encounters with his wife's relatives, using the ostensible meeting with Wheeler as a cover so he can recover from his hangover. Once Ordway leaves, Frank goes through his usual pile of papers trying to throw out or file as many as possible instead of reading them and taking action. Frank fends off invitations from other co-workers to join them for lunch, then practices a ruse on Maureen Grube by asking her to retrieve copious files related to a brochure he wrote that has found favor with upper management. The ruse serves to keep her in the office, busy, in close proximity to him, while the bulk of the workers leave for lunch. Once the floor is as empty as it will get, Frank steeps into mess. Grube's office relieves her of her duties and asks her to lunch. Further trying to conceal his actions from his co-workers, Frank gets a cab for himself and Maureen to take to a favorite restaurant. He sees other workers returning to the office as they leave and wants to laugh out loud at them. Part 1, Chapter 6. At an alcohol-fueled lunch, Maureen Grube tells her life story and sheds a few tears. She tells Frank of her early marriage at age 18 because she couldn't stand her last name, that the marriage was soon annulled, then tells about the dead-end depressing job in her small hometown, and finally her escape to New York City so she could experience life. Frank notes what he sees as affectations on her part, probably picked up from Norma, her older roommate, who is twice divorced and more worldly, wise. As the alcohol flows, Maureen's affections and spirits seem to flag until the food is brought to their table. Afterwards, her emotions seem like putty in Frank's hands. He tells her stories about himself calculated to present an image of himself as a good and promising young family man cast into a frustrating and disappointing marriage. Frank leaves the table briefly to call Maureen's supervisor at the office with a ruse that he has borrowed her for the afternoon to help him find some files, and that she should not expect to see Maureen for the remainder of the day. After lunch, they stroll briefly about, but Frank worries that one of April's friends might see them near their old neighborhood, and they go to her apartment, both quite inebriated. They couple in short order, awkwardly. Frank tries to dismiss the afternoon as a pleasant interlude and nothing more. He gives Maureen a breezy farewell and goes late to his train home. As he approaches his house, he notices that the curtains are drawn in the picture window, and as he parks in the driveway, April rushes out to meet him and puts her hand on his arm to usher him inside. April says she missed Frank all day, is sorry for their fight, and loves him. Then she leads him inside and into the kitchen where she tells him to wait as she hands him a glass of whiskey and disappears. He hears furtive giggles in the darkened dining room, then the lights come on and everyone, Michael, Jennifer, and April, shout in joyous unison, "Happy birthday!" Part 1, Chapter 7. After eating birthday cake and putting the children to bed, Frank and April face each other in the living room. April asks his forgiveness, and he remorsefully asks her what he should forgive her for. She starts to go into a long explanation, but he drags her bedroom, undresses her, and starts to make love. Then he suddenly stops and goes to the shower to scrub off the second skin of Maureen Grube that sticks to him. Frank makes passionate love to April, and she stops him from going to sleep by addressing him in her theatrical voice, telling him how much she loves him and laying out her plan that they move to Europe for good. To Frank's protestations that he could never find a job there, April says it doesn't matter because she's prepared to work to support the family while he finds himself. April believes it would be easy for her to find a job in a government agency in Paris, such as NATO, and to have enough money to hire a servant to care for the children so Frank can do whatever he wants. As they sip brandy in bed in the moonlight, Frank thanks her for her offer and tells her the idea is sweet but unrealistic. April counters that what's unrealistic is the notion that they should live in the suburbs and somehow be happy surrounded by shallow people with whom they have nothing in common. She apologizes again for being hard to live with since her involvement with the community theater, but tells her husband the experience had made her aware of what their problem is, as well as the solution. April says she doesn't want a husband who works himself into an early grave at a job he hates for a house and life in suburbia that means nothing to them. Europe, she assures him, will provide the correct cultural background for him to find a meaningful life for himself. April also recounts how she felt when she became pregnant with their first child, wanted to get an abortion, but decided against it because of his protests. She admits they were not prepared to raise a family when it happened, but asks his complicity in now finding a new life. As the night begins to become early morning and they finish the bottle of brandy, April asks Frank again in earnest if he'll go along with her plan, and he agrees wholeheartedly. Part 2, Chapter 1. With the decision to move to Paris, peace, serenity, and hope seem to return to the marriage of Frank and April Wheeler. He's more focused and comfortable at the office because he knows the end is in sight, and because he wants to work hard to impress his wife, and happier at home because their love affair has been reignited. April is energized with tasks such as getting passports and looking into overseas employment. Their children, too, seem happier because their parents' late-night fighting and loud noises have ceased. Frank makes what he thinks is a diplomatic break with Maureen Grube at the office, while trying to maintain a friendship. Perhaps because of his more relaxed frame of mind, Frank also seems better able to quickly dispatch accumulated paperwork as well as new communications. Contemporary readers will no doubt chuckle as Frank composes a letter on a dictaphone recording device about what he sees as the future of the computer, keeping tabs on the Knox business machine's parts inventory. As they nurture and cherish their plan to move to Europe, April and Frank continue to ridicule the middle-class folkways of their suburban neighbors and thank each other they're not like them. Having once boasted to April years earlier that he could speak fluent French from his time there after the war, Frank becomes sheepish at the possibility he'll be revealed as a fake. He therefore begins a subtle campaign to disabuse her of that notion, telling April that he can read signs and generally get around Paris. He reassures her that they will both pick up the language fast once they start living there. When he returns home Friday night, April informs Frank that through a scheduling snafu, they are booked for one night with the Campbells and another night with the Givings. Frank, who in another time probably would have protested, takes the news in stride since most of their life now seems dream-like and insubstantial to them both. In an ironic way, the Wheelers become more and more like the shallow suburbanites they loathe as they progress further and further with their plans to leave the country. Part 2, Chapter 2. As he polishes his shoes military style, Shep Campbell ruminates about his life growing up as the son of a wealthy, divorced mother who sent him to prep schools and sought to civilize him into the cultivated upper classes of the East Coast. But Shep is a rebel and resents his mother's efforts to soften him. Instead, he chooses to go into the army, where he is a member of a famous airborne unit and receives a big promotion, then attends a state college in the West to become a mechanical engineer. He wants nothing to do with the manners or mores of the upper class, contenting himself to identify with the blue-collar working-class folks on America. He meets Millie at college and has a son before they're married, then takes a job with a machinery plant near Phoenix, where he bakes in the desert heat and becomes disillusioned, sometimes picking fights with his wife, before he quits and the family moves to New York so Shep can decide whether he really wants to be an engineer. Meanwhile, his mother becomes ill and aged and spends the family fortune, which wasn't much money in the first place. His shoe-shine reverie is interrupted by his wife, Millie, asking about their planned evening with April and Frank Wheeler. As she talks to him, he thinks of April and the scent of her body on the night the two couples went to the log cabin to dance. Shep is in the grip of a fierce, erotic obsession with April, a fellow actor in the doomed community theater production, and as his wife gets dressed for their social evening, Shep sits in the backyard alone, sipping a beer and whispering under his breath, "I love you, April." When the Wheelers arrive, they seem quiet and withdrawn, and Shep takes silent offense at what he interprets as Frank's snobbery in gazing pointedly at their books and furniture as if passing judgment. Finally, the tension is somewhat relieved when they announce, holding hands like newlyweds, that they're moving to France. Shep and Millie are both flabbergasted. Shep keeps asking Frank if he has a job there, and Frank answers no. After their evening is over and the Wheelers leave, Shep tells his wife he considers their plan immature and poorly conceived, although he feels deeply hurt that April is leaving. When they go to bed, Shep lies awake with mad desire for April, to be in Paris with her, to feel and touch her skin. Part 2, Chapter 3. Hard working realtor Helen Givings returns home after a long Saturday of showing and selling homes. A former stenographer at a machinery plant before she and her husband Howard moved to the suburbs in 1936, Helen is neat, orderly, and dedicated to her profession. Her home is clean and crisp with Currier and Ives prints on the walls and fresh wax on the cedar floors. As she fixes afternoon tea for her almost deaf husband, Mrs. Givings reflects on her life before and after moving to her Connecticut home and feels satisfied with herself and her decisions. 67-year-old Howard Givings looks and acts older than his years. His hands shake as he takes his cup of tea. She tells him there is no cake because she's going to the Wheelers' house for a drink and a visit after an early supper. As they sip their tea, Helen Givings rehearses in her mind how she hopes the visit will go. Pleasant conversation with the Wheelers as she mentions her mathematician son John, currently a patient at the nearby Greenacre Psychiatric Hospital, and asks if he might come for a visit. She's rehearsed the event for some time since getting approval from her son's psychiatrist for him to socialize outside the Givings home on neutral territory. She recalls how open and inviting April Wheeler had been when she first brought up the subject and told her son's story. But Helen still isn't sure how to respond if the Wheelers press for details about the nature of his illness and is apprehensive when April and Frank welcome them inside. Mrs. Givings is surprised to find the Wheelers sitting calmly in their living room, having cocktails and chatting, as if they would go on in that way whether they had guests or not. When she raises the subject of a visit with the Wheelers, both April and Frank are extremely generous and suggest they come back with John the following Sunday. The pair then tell Helen Givings about their plans to move to Europe, which leaves her wide-eyed. By the time she returns home to Howard, Helen isn't sure she wants to introduce John to them because they will be leaving and their son needs permanent friends. Mrs. Givings judges the Wheelers' plan unsavory and weeps as she prepares for bed. She continues talking on and on about the Wheelers, but Howard, his hearing aid removed, is asleep. Part 2, Chapter 4. Frank's boss, Ted Bandy, asks him to come in his office to meet Bart Pollock, a large, genial man who is general sales manager for electronics. Pollock explains that he is simply crazy about the brochure Frank has written, speaking of production control, and wants him to produce a whole series of them to support the sales effort. When he imagines telling April about the experience later, Frank imagines saying it only proves what idiots the people at his company are. In his imagination, April argues that's not the case, that his superiors recognize his good work, and he should also recognize when he's done a good job. Frank pictures protesting, that he doesn't want to excel at such drivel, and April reminding him that's why they're moving to Europe. But in the meantime, there's nothing wrong with accepting their praise. Part 2, Chapter 5. The Wheelers' daughter, Jennifer, becomes emotional at the thought of packing up and moving to Europe, breaks down and cries into April's lap as Frank stands quietly at the door. April tries to comfort her by assuring Jennifer that the move to Europe will be for a very long time, but that doesn't seem to work. April sends her outside to play with her brother, Michael. Frank Wheeler tells his wife he's concerned that the move might be too much for the children, and April replies brusquely that they'll get over it. Yes, Frank agrees, but asks if it also makes sense to break their arms and ignore them just because they'll eventually get over it. April and Frank have their first fight in weeks. On the next morning, a rainy Sunday, they realize that John Givings, the mathematician and mental patient, is to come to their house for a visit in the afternoon. They take the children to stay with their neighbors, the Campbells, for the afternoon and prepare for the visit. Helen and Howard Givings appear at their door and come inside from the rain while their son stands in the rain on the driveway trying to light a cigarette. Once he gets it lit, he bounces quite nimbly inside, too. John Givings strolls stiffly about their house, inspecting everything and offering words of approval. He asks for a glass full of sherry with ice cubes, takes 2 large drinks, then sets the glass down for the rest of the afternoon while he crams himself full of cocktail sandwiches. His clothes are rumpled and tattered, despite his mother's efforts to get him to wear new clothes she's bought for him. Finally, when he gets irritated with his mother's nervous chatter, John suggests that he and the Wheelers go outside for a while. John asks Frank if he's a lawyer, explaining that he wants to find one, presumably to challenge his confinement at Greenacres. When Frank agrees with John that his job sounds stupid and meaningless, he also divulges their plans to move to Europe. John heartily agrees that their plan makes sense and explains that the 35 electroshock treatments he's had have wiped any mathematical ability clean from his brain and left him a kind of blank slate. When April remarks that John's situation sounds terrible, he mocks her and tells Frank that his wife is a very feminine creature. They go back inside the house, have a superficial conversation with John's parents about old radio shows, and then the Givings leave. April compliments Frank on how well he handled the encounter and says John seems like the only person who understands their desire to move to France. As he thinks about going back to work, Frank feels a deep sadness and says he doesn't want to go to work on Monday. April suggests he stay home. B answers that he needs to go. Part 2, Chapter 6. Bart Pollock, General Sales Manager for the Electronics Division of Knox Business Machines, takes Frank out to lunch at a nearby hotel, and Frank immediately recognizes it as the same hotel where, years earlier, he had lunch with his father and Oatfields. Pollock wines and dines Frank, flatters him, and when he learns of Frank's plans to leave the company, seeks to lure him into a high-paying position. The chapter unfolds in a series of flash-forwards, flashbacks, in which the conversation between Frank and Pollock is juxtaposed with his account that he later gives to April and her reactions. Pollock praises the direct and clear style of Frank's sales brochure, then orates at length on his philosophy of salesmanship. As Frank becomes more inebriated listening to Pollock, he interrupts to ask whether Pollock perhaps remembers his father, Earl Wheeler. As the alcohol-fueled conversation sputters along, Pollock realizes that Earl Wheeler had worked his entire career in field offices in Pennsylvania while nurturing hopes of a transfer to the home office in New York. Frank tells Pollock that when he visited New York with his father, Earl Wheeler expected a promotion to the home office from Oatfields and was crushed when it didn't happen. Pollock dismisses it with a shrug, but flatters Frank's ego by telling him that one way to honor his father would be to accept the higher-paying position that he wants to offer him as part of a select team he's assembling to usher in the computer era. Frank is pleased by the recognition, but says he's committed to his decision to leave. Pollock asks him to consider the offer and, if he decides later to take it, to have another chat. Frank agrees, but worries how to tell April that he's even agreed to reconsider. When he gets home, April doesn't feel like talking, nor does she feel like talking the next night. The next night, Frank notices April pacing about the kitchen nervously and asks her what's wrong. Shocked that her husband hasn't noticed, April tells him she's pregnant. Frank is stunned but happy as he takes her in his arms. April is disconsolate and tells him there's no way they can go to Europe if they have the baby. But Frank tells her about his job offer and says they might benefit by waiting a couple of years so they can save some money for the move to Europe. April will have none of it and asks Frank how he can ever find himself if they have another child. He answers with assurance and a newfound manliness that that's his business. Washing himself before bed, he discovers a box in the linen closet with a dark pink bulb at the end of a syringe. Frank confronts April with the abortion kit and asks angrily what she plans to do with it. April defiantly tells him she's going to use it to terminate the pregnancy, and there's nothing he can do about it. Part 3, Chapter 1. The Wheelers consult the calendar to figure out the date of conception, then figure out that they have several weeks in which to make a decision about the self-induced abortion. In that period of time, Frank Wheeler goes on an all-out campaign to change his wife's mind. There are long discussions in exotic restaurants and on long drives through the woods and in New York as they try to regain the upper hand on what has become a hot, emotional issue and to behave like the chic, sophisticated adults they believe themselves to be. April repeatedly asks Frank how he would feel even if they were able to take long vacations someday in Europe with his income as a successful employee of Knox Business Machines. She wonders whether Frank wouldn't feel that he'd somehow been forced to spend the prime years of his manhood in a meaningless job that he hated. And Frank counters with his growing sense of self-confidence. That's something he'll worry about, and he especially wouldn't want to look back and say that he was able to find himself in Europe because April had committed a criminal mutilation of herself. Meanwhile, Frank goes to lengths to project a strong masculinity of the sort that first drew April to him, to the extent that their life becomes like another courtship. Frank consciously walks a certain way, lights his cigarettes a certain way, keeps his voice at a low pitch, and demonstrates his masculine mastery of everyday situations by hiding his feelings and acting out a macho role. Despite his orchestrations, they still fight over April's statement that Frank is a more moral person than her because he seems better able to accept her pregnancy. They quarrel over the word morale and whether it means the same as conventional, with April confessing she really doesn't know the difference and Frank explaining that to him it simply means the ability to face their situation as responsible adults. Frank suggests that April seems to be acting out some kind of compulsive behavior pattern and should see a psychiatrist. Then they fight over how the psychiatrist will be paid for. Their predicament is temporarily suspended by the arrival of John Givings for another Sunday visit with the Wheelers. The former mathematician asks April and Frank whether they have time before leaving for Europe to help him find a lawyer who can tell him whether the inmates of mental institutions have any legal rights. Givings then delivers a strange soliloquy in which he discusses his own mental condition and admits he probably was insane when he menaced his mother and she called the state police to have him taken to Greenacres. His soliloquy is interrupted when he sees his father approach the house. John Givings's parents take him into their car, apologize, and leave the Wheelers. April and Frank enjoy a kind of truce until after the children are put to bed, as they read the Sunday paper. Just at bedtime, April begins a discussion about whether a woman's refusal to have a child, as in abortion, is really a refusal or denial of womanhood. Frank replies that he really doesn't know, but recalls reading something in college about the psychological theory of penis envy among women and wonders if that might play a role. As they go to bed, April asks about finding a psychiatrist and agrees to see one. Frank remains silent, but schemes in his head about ways to get April through the next 11 days when she will be able to induce an abortion. Part 3, Chapter 2. The Wheelers get varying reactions as they announce they've decided not to move to France. Their children, Michael and Jennifer, are puzzled and confused. Jennifer, the older child, becomes sullen as she tries to figure out what's going on, partly because Frank and April have decided not to tell the children about her pregnancy until later. Shep and Millie Campbell display mixed reactions too. Millie is glad that the Wheelers are staying, but concerned that it's a disappointment for them. Shep is disabused of a fantasy he created of April returning in 10 years as an old and haggard woman after supporting her family for a decade, a protective device to blunt his desire for her. Frank's co-workers are pleased, and Bart Pollock praises his decision and tells him he's on track to bigger and better things at Knox Business Machines. Helen Givings, the realtor, is shocked at the news, but tells the Wheelers she's pleased while showing signs of stress that their house will be taken off the market. Frank awakens on a bright August morning to realize that this is the last day, according to April's calendar, when she could successfully perform an auto-abortion. Gleefully, he tells April, who seems unenthusiastic. When he asks if she has any regrets, she replies that it would be a little too late for her to have any. When he awakens the next morning, Frank feels a sense of dread rather than relief as he realizes that he really doesn't really want another child either. Frank works harder on his promotional brochure, stays later at the office until one afternoon he encounters Maureen Grube after most of the other employees have gone home. They speak to each other in erotically charged voices, and Frank approaches her with the loose, almost sleepy gait of a man who knows exactly what he's doing. The tension at the end of this chapter propels the reader quickly into the next, as the author employs the narrative device of suspense. Part 3, Chapter 3. Bored with each other's company, The Campbells and the Wheelers head out for an evening of dancing and drinking at Vito's log cabin, where a delinquent drummer who thinks he's Gene Krupa leads a retro jazz unit that plays swing music. It's a popular teenage hangout on Route 12 because couples can meet away from supervising adults, be served alcohol illegally, and because its spacious parking lot afford lots of dark spaces. In the rowdy atmosphere of the tavern, April remains her aloof self while Frank gets high and decides to stop worrying about whether she's happy anymore. The loud gyrations of the drummer remind him of the erotic moves of Maureen Grube, and he smiles happily as the drinking and dancing progresses. Eventually, Millie Campbell gets sick after dancing with Frank and returns from the bathroom to announce that she needs to go home. All four walk outside to the parking lot, past couples necking in cars, to discover that the Campbell's car is blocked in place because of other cars parked around it. In their booze-addled state, Frank and Shep try to figure out who should drive, which car, when and where. April coolly interjects that Frank should take Millie home so they can both release their babysitters. Then she and Shep will return later once his car is liberated. Off they drive, and as he watches the red lights of the Wheeler's car disappear, Shep marvels briefly how it is that he's alone with April. He searches her face for any signs of complicity, but finds none. He takes her in his arms, and they dance and drink more until he's quite plastered. He checks to see if the car is still blocked in and is pleased to find it is. So he returns to April. She tells Shep of her lonely childhood and young adulthood, that she missed out on a lot of experiences young people usually have, such as love affairs. During a break in the music, Shep and April go outside to the parking lot to talk wait until the car is cleared. They begin kissing in the parking lot, and by the time they're inside the car, they're ripping each other's clothes off. Afterwards, Shep begins to mumble about his love for April, but she hushes him, tells him to take her home, and not to discuss their affair. She doesn't want to discuss love, April says, because she doesn't know who Shep is. Or for that matter, she doesn't know who she herself is, either. Part 3, Chapter 4. Having completed 3 more marketing brochures for Bart Pollock, Frank Wheeler confidently decides it's time for him to break off his affair with Maureen Grube. As he gets off the bus in her New York neighborhood on a Friday afternoon, he is approached by a brassy young woman on the street who identifies herself as Norma Townsend, Maureen's roommate, and asks Frank if they can have a chat. Seated at a nearby coffee bar, Norma grills Frank about his involvement with Maureen and tells him she's miffed that Maureen canceled plans to go to Cape Cod with her and some friends so she could be with Frank. Norma tells Frank that Maureen is a sweet young girl who's been through some hard times and needs friendship, not an affair with a married man. Frank listens, then tells her she's a meddling, tiresome woman, possibly a latent lesbian, and very definitely a pain in the ass. Frank storms out of the bistro and chuckles with delight as he watches the manly, awkward Norma hailing a cab to the airport. When he encounters Maureen in her apartment, she asks Frank if the front door is locked, then proceeds to do a new dance for him, writhing and moving suggestively in a sort of bawdy house hula. She pulls him to the bed and gives him a deep sexual kiss. Once he extricates himself, Frank soberly tells her their affair is over at about the same time as the air fills with the smell of burning veal scallopini. Frank tries to soften the blow, but Maureen orders him out of her apartment. He gets drunk on the train ride home, trying to expunge the memory of Maureen. By Sunday afternoon, Frank is ready to begin letting go of the whole affair, and he approaches April in a conciliatory fashion, telling her that his big promotion, with plenty of money for obstetrics and psychiatry, is insured. April seems only mildly interested, and when Frank asks why she hasn't been sleeping with him, April tells him it's because she doesn't love him and never has. Frank decides to tell her about Maureen, stressing that she is just some girl in New York and not mentioning that they work together, and that in any event, it's all over. April asks him why he did it. Frank tries to explain that it may have been because his masculinity was threatened by her talk of an abortion or some other neurotic reason. April answers that she doesn't care about the fact he had an affair or even why, because she doesn't care about him. She asks why he told her, wondering whether it's because he wants to provoke some kind of jealous reaction on her part. Frank becomes angry and follows her around the house with demands that April admit she loves him. Part 3, Chapter 5. Howard and Helen Givings drive to Greenacres to bring their son, John, home for another Sunday visit with the Wheelers. On the drive from the mental hospital, John is aggressively rude toward his mother, mocking her and demanding to know exactly why the Wheelers have decided not to move to France. Mrs. Givings says she doesn't feel it's any of her business to probe and find out exactly why, but when they arrive at the Wheelers' house, John assumes a prosecutorial tone in grilling Frank about the issue. Frank moves closer to April and says it should be obvious why they made such a decision. Mrs. Givings, ever the realtor, offers to find them a bigger house for their soon-to-be enlarged family. But John persists with his questions, asking whether people in Europe have babies. Mr. and Mrs. Givings both try to quiet their son, but he persists in transgressing every social norm of politeness and continues with his interrogation as to why the Wheelers changed their minds. Frank hints that it's because they decided they couldn't afford the move, after all, and John seems to accept that explanation for a moment, but then rejects it and demands to know the real reason. He suggests that Frank succumbed to April's desire for another child and doesn't have the masculinity to stand up for himself. Frank becomes enraged and threatens to pummel John if he doesn't shut up. Mrs. Givings protests that her son is not well, but Frank says that doesn't matter, and he'll punch his lights out. John continues with his sarcastic insults, turning to April and telling her that she and Frank probably deserve each other. Howard and Helen Givings take their son by the arms and try to gently move him out of the house and back into the car. John goes along peacefully, then turns and yells back to the Wheelers that he's grateful he'll not be their next child. Part 3, Chapter 6. Frank sits alone in the quiet house with all the lights off, looking in the direction of where April is hiding in the dark. He watches as a cigarette glows in the darkness, moving to and from her mouth, then finally is extinguished. April slips inside, goes to the phone, and calls Millie Campbell to ask if their children can stay the night since it's late, and they're too tired to come and pick them up. Suddenly, the living room lights go on, and April and Frank stare bug-eyed at each other. April quietly goes to the sofa and lies down, with her back facing Frank. He takes the whiskey bottle and goes to bed alone in their bedroom and dreams or fantasizes that April is beside him, holding his hand and soothing him. When he awakens alone, he realizes that he must go to work even though he doesn't want to. Frank drags himself to the kitchen, where a perky April asks whether he'd like his eggs scrambled or fried. They have a pleasant chat about his work while they eat breakfast, as if nothing had happened the night before. April seems very attentive to her husband's every word and genuinely interested in his work. Amazed, Frank, for the first time, opens up to her completely, as he wonders whether they may have finally gotten all the fighting out of their systems and have nothing to talk about except the surface pleasantries of life. Pleasantly delighted with their morning, Frank gives April a gentle kiss, and they wish each other a good day as he leaves for work to learn more about the big promotion that Bart Pollock has in mind for him. Part 3, Chapter 7. April Wheeler waves a smiling farewell to Frank as he drives off to work in an old Ford, finds a spot to sit in the sun, and splashes cold water on her face before calling Millie Campbell to tell her either she or Frank will be coming by to pick up the children today or tomorrow. Although her gums ache from too many cigarettes the night before, she lights another cigarette and retrieves the crumpled copy of a letter she tried to write to her husband during the night in which she declares there's no love between them and they both know it. Instead of finishing the letter, she takes it outside to an incinerator and burns it, sits down, and has a flashback to her childhood when her itinerant, long-absent father comes for a rare visit to see her where she lives with aunts and uncles. She's ecstatic and asks in natural childlike fashion if he's brought her a present. Her father, whom she adores, scratches around, looks in his car, then opens one of his suitcases and pulls out a bottle of White Horse whiskey. Attached to the neck of the bottle is a tiny white horse, which he removes and gives to her before leaving. After the letter is burned, April returns to the house, pulls out a fresh sheet of paper, and writes a brief note. Dear Frank, whatever happens, please don't blame yourself. She takes her abortion kit out and puts the syringe in boiling water on the kitchen stove. Then she goes to the bathroom and prepares for the abortion by laying out towels and writing down the phone number of the hospital on a piece of paper propped up next to the phone. As she waits for the syringe to become sterilized, she remembers what her parents, aunt, and uncle told her. Anything that is completely honest and true must be done alone. Part 3, Chapter 8. Millie Campbell hears a siren coming from the direction of the Wheelers' house and has a strong sense that April is in trouble. Mrs. Givings calls to ask Millie what happened at the Wheelers where she's seen the ambulance, but can get no one to answer the phone. Extremely agitated, if for no other reason than the fact the Wheelers' children are still at her house, Millie Campbell calls her husband Shep at work to see if he can help. Shep makes phone calls to the hospital, the ambulance company, and around town with military efficiency and finds that, yes, April Wheeler has been admitted to emergency for uncontrolled bleeding following a miscarriage. He calls his wife to inform her, then calls Frank Wheeler in New York and gets him out of a conference to give him the news. Shep tries to reassure Frank that April is okay and getting good medical care, and plans to meet him at the Stamford train station when the next train comes in from New York. At the hospital, Shep tries to reassure himself that everything is fine as Frank is whisked away by a nurse for a private talk. When Frank returns, he tells Shep that the doctor said the fetus was gone by the time the ambulance arrived, that she'd already lost a lot of blood, and that they had to operate to remove the placenta, which caused more bleeding that they were now trying to control as April lay unconscious. Shep leaves for a moment to go to the bathroom and fetch them some coffee, and is elsewhere in the hospital when April dies. When he returns, he sees the empty corridor, then Frank being led out on the arms of two of the doctors, talking about hemorrhaging and the shock to April's system of the whole experience. Shep takes Frank from the hospital and they drive aimlessly about for hours, sucking on a whiskey bottle, Frank repeating over and over the story of how sweet and pleasant April had been that very morning. Frank then follows that observation with the opinion that April took her own life deliberately. Millie Campbell, chewing on her handkerchief with grief and anxiety, awaits the return of her husband after putting the Wheeler children to bed early. When she sees Frank with his hollowed-out expression, Millie begins to weep and runs to another room. Shep and Millie decide to take turns sitting with Frank, and when Millie returns to the kitchen a few hours later, her husband is passed out with his head on the table and Frank Wheeler is missing. Frank, in a fit of drunken madness, has run through the dark and muddy woods from Revolutionary Hill Estates to his own house, where he finds that April has left no more mess behind than a few drops of blood from the bathroom to the telephone and back. There are a couple of blood and water-soaked towels in the tub. After cleaning up, Frank wanders about the house turning lights on and then off, finding it impossible to believe April is dead with her presence, so real and vivid in their house. He sits in her clothes closet, where he can smell and touch her clothes, until he hears the Campbells drive up his driveway, enter the house, and call his name. Then April's presence evaporates, and she is gone. Part 3, Chapter 9. In the aftermath of April's death, Millie Campbell recounts numerous times the final resolution of the Wheeler family. The fact that their children moved in with Frank's brother and wife in Pittsfield while Frank lived in New York City and worked for the new firm of Bart Pillock Associates, a computer spin-off from Knox Business Machines, and saw his children on weekends. Millie recalls how nervous she was at the closing of the sale of the house of Revolutionary Road to another young couple named Brace, and how everything worked out fine with Frank's pleasant demeanor. Fearing his wife rattle on yet another time about the Wheelers to the Braces, Shep Campbell leaves his living room, heads for the kitchen, and makes himself a stiff drink, snarling and cursing under his breath about how Frank had been turned into pleasant, empty shell of a man since April's death. With spring approaching, Shep recalls, too, the previous spring and working with April as a cast member of the Petrified Forest for the Laurel Players. Recalling April and her special way of moving on stage, Shep thrusts his fist into his mouth and weeps alone in the darkness until he decides to stop before he begins to embellish his pain and thus corrupt it, haunted at first by the thought that the visit of her insane son, John Givings, had some connection with April's demise. Helen Givings has a slow and painful recovery. She takes small comfort in the fact that she and her husband, Howard, had decided after his last visit to the Wheelers not to bring him home anymore from Greenacres, but to only visit him at the hospital. Mrs. Givings buys a puppy, too, for companionship and to help heal the emotional scars of the Wheelers' tragedy. Sitting at home one evening with her husband, Mrs. Givings chatters about how pleasant it is to be in their comfortable little suburban world, just the two of them, and how pleased she is that the Wheelers' old house that had stood dark and dreary all winter had finally been sold. She tells her husband, Howard, that she liked the Wheelers, although there was something whimsical and neurotic about them. She tells him that she was offended when, as realtor for the property, she found in the basement the box of sedum plantings she had gathered for the Wheelers, unplanted. As she continues with her monologue about the Wheelers, her husband turns off his hearing aid and smiles at the glorious silence.